We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 219 for July 28th, 2021. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk about pay scales in archaeology, what goes into a pay scale, and what's a living wage. So get out your TI-86 because only cool kids know what that is, and because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. And here's a little editor's note before we get started. My audio completely dropped out in segment 3 after the first few minutes, so Heather actually wraps up the show, which I appreciate. I just wanted to let you guys know that. I tried to sneak in a goodbye at the end, but I don't even know if it was on the recording. So on to the show. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Heather in Southern California, despite what she may say about Southern California.
Central, Southern, whatever.
It's Southern. It's Southern. Compared to Bill in Northern California.
Yeah, hi. And if you look at the map, San Francisco Bay Area is not really that far north. There's still a lot of more California north of here.
There's like 1,000 miles between the two of you. You can't both be central. So you gotta cut the line somewhere.
All right. I'll stick with the north.
All right. And then we've got Doug over in Scotland, who may join us later, although he had some child mishaps starting right at the start of the show. So we may not see him at all. But if we do, if we do, we'll bring him in. So Heather brought us today's topic, and we're going to talk about pay scales, as I mentioned in the introduction. And actually, Heather, you dropped this MIT living wage calculator here, and I first saw it when Sonia, one of the other hosts of this show, dropped it in one of the Facebook groups there. Yeah. And we're going to talk about that. So this was your topic. Why don't you go ahead and introduce it, and we'll get started.
So, recently, for those that follow some of the sites on Facebook and other platforms, I don't know, it seems like it's a topic that comes and goes, but it's definitely a hot topic that I think it's consistently talked about. And then it kind of, rears its head again. And then, of course, that comes along with the idea of unionizing and how that could improve things. We've already covered that in another podcast. Mm-hmm. But I think that it's important because I do think it's an important discussion to have. But I really think that it would be helpful to really talk about the complexities of pay, why pay is discussed, why sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, what impacts pay, and maybe some of the questions that, that have been posed on these boards. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there. One of them being that, the big brother or whatever, the firm is out to basically screw techs. And, I think in some cases that probably is the truth, but in many more cases, that's not the case at all. And I think it would be really helpful to everyone listening to understand all of the nuances behind pay, wage ranges, that they're not arbitrary, that there's a lot of other aspects that come to play. And then I think that understanding those nuances will improve people's, number one, opportunity to be able to be paid more, because then you're going to know when to ask for more, when a little bit, lower pay rate is actually fair, and when it's not. And then also, I think just your overall well-being, professionally, personally, emotionally, will be a lot better when you feel like you're not being taken advantage of. And I think the other thing is that people need to understand that they do have the control. Like, nobody's forcing you to take a job. Now, I know people need work, but sometimes it takes, just like anything in any profession, you're not going to find the perfect job right off the bat. And so you really have to be engaged. The only way to go and advocate for yourself is to be knowledgeable.
Right.
And so that's where I'm hoping this episode is going to help from the perspective of people that actually create bids, create these proposals and the contracts that impact what people in the field make.
Yeah. And you started off this discussion by, mentioning that a lot of people think that when they're getting paid something that they don't think is fair or, what have you, that they're just being screwed by the employer. And yeah, you're right. Sometimes that is true. I mean, there are definitely unscrupulous people out there. However, another thing that we have to talk about just briefly before we even get into pay is that for an employer, especially really small employers. Now, when you work for bigger engineering firms, yes, you have a budget. Yes, you have a project, but you're less concerned with the overall numbers, right? The higher you get, the more you're concerned with the numbers your department's bringing in. But even at like the project manager level at bigger companies, you don't know what the budget for the entire department is most of the time. Like you have no idea. And those just aren't numbers that you're dealing with. But when you get down to a smaller firm, like say mine, I just added one more person to my payroll this week, and that significantly increased what I'm paying out just by adding one more person, because I only had two before. Now I have one more that's joined us, and that's a lot of money, right? So, but you have to factor in that there's other stuff besides pay that are going through these business owners' minds, right? They have the project budgets, they have everything else that they need to pay for, your insurance, your vehicles. I'm constantly thinking that, a vehicle is going to break down. Even though I got the bring it back in pieces insurance on the rental vehicle, that rental vehicle is costing me $6,500 for 2 months. That's also not an insignificant amount of money. And then there's just so many different factors that come in, and pay is, for a business owner, pay is only one of them. And yes, it is for a lot of people, a way to save money is to actually pay less. That's not a joke. But unless you're paying like way less, I don't really see it. Like I honestly don't see it. If I paid $2 or $3 less per hour, what does that save me? A few $100s a paycheck? I mean, it's just not worth it.
I don't think people realize that there are so many other factors. It's not just somebody saying, I don't want to pay them, like you said, $3 more. It's because it really doesn't make a difference. In fact, I mean, there's a little bit of a side note, but recently we have a lot of surveys. There's unfortunately an increasing amount of homelessness in certain areas that we're surveying. And I just don't feel safe anymore sending people out, certainly not by themselves. And sometimes it needs to be more than two. And so there are proposals that I've written, and the budget was created with the idea of one or two people. And now I'm adding another person. And really, does it eat into some of the profit? It does. And profit margins are small in this business. They're not big, no matter what people think. They really aren't. Because there is so much, like you're saying, so much overhead that goes into, the ultimate profit, that take away from the ultimate profit. But to me, it's worth the safety and, well-being of the employees to add that whole other person. And you would think that make a huge difference. It does somewhat, but not to the point that people think. And so I think that, a lot of times, it is contracts that, even your employer, whoever you're working for, doesn't have a whole lot of sway with. There's some larger agencies that my company works for, and you wouldn't believe some of the things that they will not pay for, period, such as mileage. They do not pay for mileage. They will not pay for hotels. They will not pay for per diem. They absolutely will not pay for it. And that's in the contract. We have, let's say, a 5-year on needed as needed on-call contract with this agency, and we're locked into that contract. Next time we can change it is maybe 2 years from the time we're dealing with it right then and there. And, companies need to realize that, or companies are always kind of adding in and have to have some kind of buffer, because I actually have a project right now where we have people we're having to truck in, and we're having to put them in a hotel, and the agency is absolutely not paying for the hotel. So as a company, we're eating all hotel, all per diem, all mileage, and all drive time. And we're not making any money. It's just one of those jobs where we know we're just going to eat it. We're not going to make any money on this particular job. We'll make more money on the next on-call job that we get from this agency. But these are the things that I think people that don't have to deal with those kinds of decisions need to understand, that there's always needs to be some kind of buffer there to cover these situations that you just can't anticipate. So you try your best to.
I mean, field techs listening to this would probably argue, why did you bid on that job if you're going to lose so much money on it?
Well, I mean? Yeah, but the thing is that sometimes you don't know. So let's say you bid on that job a year ago.
Yeah.
And now I'll say for this one, it's somewhat of remote. When we bid on it, we thought it was drivable, but now there's a lot of work going on in this mountain road. And so that people, it's taking them 2 hours just to get from one place to the beginning of the foothills up to the location sometimes because of construction. So now where they could have driven in and we could have had a local person drive in, we can't even have a local person drive in. They have to, local, quote unquote. They're an hour away. Now we have an hour plus another 2 hours, another hour and a half. That doesn't even make sense. We have to put them in a hotel. So those are those things you just don't know. Or sometimes, let's say you had a local person or a few local people, and now they're on other jobs. And, we're all so crazy busy right now. We just have to take who we can get. And so now we have to pay for that hotel. So those are those things that you just don't know. And, proposals that we put in, it doesn't happen for a year. We bid on it and it doesn't happen from a year from that point. So,
right.
You can't anticipate everything. You try your best,
Sure.
but you can't.
Yeah, I know. As an example, I usually pay across the board, unless for some reason some agency tells me not to. I usually, bid my projects with 130 for per diem. And that's just what I do, right? I try to make that my minimum. And if it's got to be more because of the area, cost of living or whatever, which in some places it does have to be more. You can't get a hotel room for less than $120 a night. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I would expect it to be down there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's getting bad here in Elko. Like most of the hotel rooms that are half decent are $100 a night. And that $30 a day is not going to get you food. All right. So for some reason, we got cut off in that first segment. So we're going to take it to break right now. And then we're going to come back in segment 2 and have a little bit longer discussion in segment 2. Back in a minute. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months or go to zencastr.com and use the code CRMARC. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com. And look for the link in the show notes to this episode. Welcome back to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 219, and we are talking about pay scales. And because we got cut off in the last segment, I don't really know why. This is a really weird thing. It's never happened before. But either way, we never really ended up talking about pay scales. That's a good start to the show.
Went down the rabbit hole.
I know it's pretty typical, though, right? I know it's pretty typical. So let's jump into that because we spent some time talking about other factors that are dealing with your pay, and we just have to understand that those are a thing. And then move on, right? Yes. This discussion is about pay. So let's talk about that. Heather, what's up with this MIT living wage calculator that we have linked to in the show notes?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. It works really well. I think it's a bit low just for the areas that I punched in that I'm familiar with. And so I don't think it's not a go-to. I think it's a good tool along with other tools as far as figuring out the living wage, minimum wage. And so you put in your county or you put in your state, you put in the county, and then it gives you a table of minimum wage, living wage, and what people should expect. And it also includes the family dynamic. So are you married? Do you have children? So these are things that employers are not looking and they're not paying people based on, they really shouldn't pay people based on how many kids they have, right? That's not fair. But it is an indicator of what you as an employee need to reasonably expect or search out. So it's not something you're going to come in, or for me at least, and maybe somebody else has another opinion. I would never expect somebody to come in and say, okay, this is exactly what I should be making. I expect you to give me this. And it doesn't matter what job it is that I'm asking for. I mean, I think people need to say, okay, this is, the calculator tells me I really need to make this much in order to survive, or in order to at least have a living wage. And so I'm going to go out and look for jobs that will give me that pay rate.
Right.
So you can't force or, try to get a square peg in a round hole. Now, there are times where people are being unfair and they're not paying enough, but a lot of times the onus is on the employee to go and find a job that does pay that. So you can't go in and say, okay, I need, in order to survive, because I have 5 kids and a wife, that I need to make $30 an hour. So I'm going to go to the gas station and insist that I make $30 an hour. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
You need to make $30 an hour. Therefore, you build your skill set to get to the point where you're getting a job that does pay you $30 an hour.
Right. And just looking at this thing too, like I typed in Reno, Nevada, and the living wage for somebody, one adult with no children, so presumably somebody living by themselves with no kids, is $13.57 an hour. And that takes a whole bunch of things into account as assumptions, like your typical expenses here. But I think 2 things we got to look at when you're looking at something like this as somebody in CRM in the United States or anywhere else where you're working remote jobs and you're not living at home most of the time, is first off, these expenses are going to be vastly different for somebody who doesn't have a regular 9-to-5 Monday through Friday job, right? Like our expenses are very different. We pay way less in some cases, but way more in other cases. Like transportation is probably going to be more because nobody pays you to drive across the country to go to a job. Of course, nobody tells you to take a job across the country too, although I've driven many thousands of miles for a 4-week job before. Sometimes you just go where the work is.
Or the fact that you try to get a 4-wheel drive, people expect, where you could show up in a smart car if you worked at McDonald's, right? So.
Yeah. Well, in a lot of cases in CRM, you don't need a 4-wheel drive because you're not using your vehicle as a field vehicle either, right? Unless it's a camping project and you got to get to the campsite. But there's other stuff on here like, what is it? Like medical. Medical is probably going to cost you a hell of a lot more than it's saying here because it's not subsidized by anybody, right? Even if you're on the Affordable Care Act, it's still not super cheap depending on who you are, how old you are, what sex you are, what other pre-existing medical conditions you have. There's all kinds of factors there that take into account. And the biggest one for me that people need to be aware of, especially employers that are listening to this, is you can't I can't type in Reno, Nevada and say, okay, great, my pay scale is looking good, because only one of my employees actually lives in Reno. The other one just came from New York City. I typed his in, and luckily I'm still paying him over the living wage, but it got a lot closer to what I'm paying him because on these projects, if you're hiring seasonal field technicians, you can't be like, what are you bitching about the pay for? Because I'm paying you the living wage for Missoula, Montana, but you've got people coming in from all over the country that have expenses from the places where they live that they still have to pay. They're still paying taxes in that state. They're still paying for probably an apartment or a house. Their vehicle's registered there. All the stuff is for that state, not for where you're hiring them. And that's just something no one ever takes into account. They pay you for the local area, which I get, I guess, because it's easy, but it's not fair. So,
but is it, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. There are times where people have skill sets that it's worth bringing somebody in from another area. But many times people are working outside of their state because they're choosing to do that. Either it's because they just want the adventure, or because that state has a lot more work, or because they want experience and try out that state to see whether or not that's a place they'd want to live. It's a learning curve. It's, some of that I think the employee needs to be willing to pay for that. Like if I'm hiring somebody, I could hire somebody local. I'm hiring you because you're pursuing this job, which I like that. But it doesn't mean though, then I need to be penalized to pay you because you live in Manhattan and you want a job in Missouri. I shouldn't then have to match Manhattan.
Yeah. But on the flip side, though, you're actually in a desirable area. Like my wife and I specifically shovel bummed across the country to go work in the West while we still had Eastern expenses to pay in South Carolina. And we were getting twice the pay that we were used to, more per diem. I mean, we were living like kings and queens in the West working over here until we started living in the West. Then it all equalized.
Yes.
But, so you're living in a good area for that. So I think Bill's got a question. Bill.
It feeds into what you were just saying about how living in the West, the pay rates are higher and, depending on where you're at, you can, possibly make more money. How do you see the crunch in quality field techs affecting this whole situation? Because, hypothetically, we could have situations where folks are living in, more affordable places, the Midwest, the Southeast and stuff like that. And then just coming out West and working their way across, or not working their way across, but just specifically targeting the West, making as much money as they possibly can. And then when the field season's over, just going back to those affordable places. Do you think it's going to be opened up like that? Or do you think that we're going to need to cultivate more folks in these more expensive locations so that you can save on the cost of lodging and all that other stuff?
Well, I mean, for me, Chris, you probably have a different perspective, but for me, so when I'm looking at hotels for a project, it doesn't take much for me to think putting someone in a hotel is a good idea. So, because if you look at it, what I'm billing a client or what I'm paying out, if the person has to drive a couple hours, it's almost better, more efficient, more cost efficient to put them in a hotel. And it also, they enjoy that. Now, I shouldn't say they enjoy it, but they certainly nobody likes being in the hot heat, right? Or in the, hot field day and then have to go and drive a couple hours. So somebody could still be local and I'm still putting them in a hotel. And so for me, the hotel, I'm almost putting that into bids, regularly because especially in California, I mean, people are so spread out that even if they're in California and they're considered local, they're not really.
Yeah, because if you go by the hours and the amount of time it takes to get there, folks that in Southern California, I mean, if you can live 20 miles away and it takes you an hour and 40 minutes to get to the place because there just is no other way. There's no transit. There's no other way. You've got to drive yourself there. And kind of the miles don't really matter in Southern California. It's the amount of hours it takes to get there.
Yes. So if you think about it, you have somebody who lives an hour and a half away. That's 3 hours drive time. Let's say you're billing them out at $60 an hour. That's $180 right there. You got your hotel room. Why wouldn't you put them in a hotel?
Well, and it seems like this strategy that I'm talking about of living in a place like Iowa or Arkansas or something like that, and then just spending your summers in California, if you've got the skills and the connections and stuff, that can totally be a viable way. And then in the wintertime, you have another job, because then on the other side, you don't have to pay any of the expenses of living in Southern California. Sure, you live in a hotel room and everything, and that's got its benefits and drawbacks. But at least, especially if you were kind of, living in a tiny home or something like that, or were fully mobile, like Chris living in an RV or whatever, your vacation, your residency is in a way cheaper state. You're paying way less on taxes, and you're working and getting way more money. Sometimes possibly enough, depending on where you're at, to make it all winter and not have to get another job.
Right, and the one thing that is kind of can be a thorn in your side is if, let's say, you have a week in between and it doesn't make sense to go back home, but you don't have work for a week, then you really start eating into, I'm talking about from the employee's perspective, you start eating into what the profit that you've made. And so, you have to weigh that out. There's definitely there's a risk in working in an area unless you really do, like I said, have very good contacts and you're good at what you do. I mean, the market, dictates, and if you prove that through skill set and good attitude and hard work ethic that you are valuable, probably you're not going to have a problem, getting regular work. But if you're just doing it and kind of mailing it in, it might be a little bit more difficult.
I guess that's where the whole van life, living in a van by the river that we were talking about. The Chris Farley, I guess that's where it comes in big time. If you've got a van and you can just go out to the Angeles National Forest and not stay there more than 30 days or however many days it says you can stay there, then right on, you're good.
We have people that do that.
Now here's the thing, right? So like we've got this RV that we're living in. We just recorded the Archaeotech podcast, which released last week as you're listening to this show. And I put it right out there because I don't care that I just got a new solar and lithium battery install that will help us. It's called boondocking when you're in the RV world. It'll help us stay off grid and really just outside of RV parks a lot more, right? Because before we got this set up, we could comfortably, without replenishing our water and dumping our tanks, it really wasn't a power issue, but without replenishing our water and dumping our tanks, I mean, we were about a week that we could stay out of the grid, right? It's easy to go find a dump station and refill your water, but then you're still constantly dealing with power and, you know, just running the generator, and nobody wants to do that. And the generator takes gas anyway, and it's just kind of all a pain in the ass. Well, we spent $12,500 on this upgrade, but I seriously think that with what we're going to do for the next year, that we'll easily make that up in not paying park fees at different places, because we'll be able to stay off grid more often and in more different areas than we were able to before because of this setup that we have. And that is kind of my point is... You have to plan for whatever living expenses that you have, right? And both Heather and Bill, you guys have mentioned certain aspects of something that I don't think people talk about enough, which is you're not a contractor when you're working as a field tech most of the time because of the rules around what a contractor is. Sonia has talked about that on the show many times. Anytime an employer tells you you will be here at this time, boom, you're all of a sudden not a contractor, right? So that's one of many things, but that's the easiest one to land on because that's always going to happen. So the fact that you're not a contractor means you're an employee. And I feel like the mindset of field techs and crew chiefs and people just in this business that don't have a salaried 9-to-5 job, they think of themselves as employees. And then they look at their pay at the end of the year and they go, you know what? I was destitute for many times during the field season, and I'm not getting paid enough because I'm not able to, at the end of the day, at the end of the year, get all my bills paid and do everything. Well, that's because you're living paycheck to paycheck like everybody else is, and you're not living like a contractor. A contractor knows that they have other expenses to pay, has to run themselves like a business. And if I had it to do all over again, I wish somebody had told me this because I was doing the same thing. I would look at each year in January when it starts and go, okay, you know what? I need to have 3 months salary in the bank. And I know that sounds like a lot of money, but I need to have 3 months salary in the bank. And maybe when I get that one sweet job that is down in Southern California working for Heather, where I'm getting some good per diem and I'm getting a good wage, I'm not going to blow that on new shocks for my truck and, a new computer and some camera equipment or something like that. I'm going to put a higher percentage of that in the beginning of the year in the bank, because like Bill said, you go work or I think it was you, Heather, you go work down in San Diego, you make some good money, and then you're a week off on your way back to Iowa. Well, that week off, nobody thinks about. It's not vacation. It's unpaid week off. And you have to account for that. Yes. And just too many people don't think about their jobs like they're contractors, like they're running a business of themselves. Right. And they just don't plan for those expenses.
Well, I definitely think that they don't consider risk. So any business person, you always have to consider risk, and you have to build risk into your business, model. And too many people don't do that. And they just feel entitled that, if I don't have a job and I'm not making as much as I think I should, that's someone else's fault and not mine. And I would say that, that's faulty thinking, because, whether you think something's fair or not, you're still not going to improve your chances at all by just, blaming others and not looking at how you can improve your situation. And it really does get down to you become angry, you become resentful, you're not happy in your job. Everybody I know, and I've been in this for a while, and I've met so many people, and I was an as-needed consultant for many years. Everyone I know that works their butt off and that has a good attitude and is professional in the field and continues to improve themselves make decent money. So there is responsibility that the employee has to make themselves
Accountable?
attractive as an employee.
Yeah, attractive.
And, I think there's a couple things that I think is right along that line that I'd like to talk about is the idea that people come out with this automatic, with this expected, I'm going to make this amount as a college undergraduate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I've graduated, with a BA or BS. And then they have this specific idea. I can't tell you how many people apply for jobs, senior archaeology jobs with an MA or a PhD with no experience. And they expect they're going to make $70,000 a year. They have no experience. It doesn't matter to me what degree you have behind your name. You are useless to me. You are not going to be able to make the company money to the point where I can justify paying you $70,000 a year. You're not there yet. But people, Chris, I don't know if you're coming across this, but it is so common that people come in and that is what they expect. Somebody who comes out with a BA and they think they should be making $30 an hour with absolutely no experience. To me, it's mind-boggling. I don't understand it. And when I was consulting, I can't tell you how much work I did and did not charge or bill or put it in my timesheet because I understood I was being given an opportunity to do something kind of above my ability level, and there was going to be a learning curve. And I just my own conscience didn't think it was the right thing to put that on my timesheet. And so I said, okay, I'm going to invest in myself and give some extra hours so that I learn how to do this. Then I did not charge the company I was working for. But it doesn't seem, that mindset is, I don't think that prevalent anymore.
Right. Well, we're going to take it to break here in a second, but I will just leave you with somewhat of an agreement on what you're saying and then somewhat not, because this other job that I do, the software implementation thing, there is a massive learning curve for this. And I have definitely, and I'm basically a contractor with this company. Well, I am a contractor with this company. So I've done a lot of things where I actually didn't charge the hours either, where I'm watching a release video or I'm doing something else because I feel like my information and my knowledge is lacking in a certain area that, I just want to increase my skill set and learn this one thing. And it's not really a client related activity. And it's just something that's kind of helping me. So I have not actually started my clock on that, where I started a different clock because I track all my time. But that being said, that's kind of a messed up mindset that Americans have, I feel like. You know what I mean? Like, why shouldn't your employer pay for you to get better, pay for you to learn more, and pay for you to just take some time for yourself to better yourself on the job? Because in the end, it just benefits them. You know what I mean? In the end, it's beneficial to them that you know more about GIS, that you know more about historics or prehistorics or, NHPA or NEPA or something like that. But it's our...
Yeah, I don't argue with you on that.
But it's our need as I feel like Americans. I don't know if this is uniquely American or not, but a lot of employment things we do are totally messed up, and it's uniquely American. But our desire, our tendency to not take vacations. We're happy to get 2 weeks out of the year with most employers, maybe 3 weeks if you really work there long enough. Whereas other countries give 6 weeks across the board, whether you're new or not. It's just we have a different emphasis on employment, and it's I don't know. It's a little messed up, in my opinion, our attitudes towards these whole things. Let's talk about these on the other side of the break in segment 3. Back in a minute. You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to ArchPodNet.com/shop for a link. That's ArchPodNet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show. Welcome back to the final segment of episode 219 of the CRM Archaeology podcast. And we're talking pay and pay scales. So we had kind of a long intermission. I don't even remember where we were, but let's keep this thing rolling.
I would like to just consider a couple other points just to make sure that we're staying on track with trying to give those people who are employees or techs in the field, what is the perspective from managers and and why pay ranges are communicated the way they are and why they fluctuate the way they do. And so, there's one, I was explaining this to a colleague who's trying to formulate a budget for a really large field project. And so when you're formulating a budget, you don't know ahead of time who's going to be available to you. You know, though, what roles you need. And so what I was trying to explain is that we're going into another area of the country. So we're not even dealing with the crew that we normally do. And so now he's trying to figure out how not only how to create the budget, but then how many people to hire. And so, and at what pay rates. And so when you're looking at, everybody knows, let's say you have a crew of 4, that 4 has somebody who's more of a crew supervisor, and then you have a field director. So you would have, and you may have, let's say you may have 16 crew techs, and you have 4 crew supervisors and maybe 2 field directors, that kind of thing. And so when you're hiring people, you're hiring based on what your need is. So it's not like anybody who comes to me, I'm just going to give them all the same amount. That's not how it works. So if we have somebody who comes to me and let's say they are absolutely a field director level person and they should be paid that amount. But at this point, I've already filled my 2 field director positions. And so that is sometimes when you are skilled enough, you have to understand that you can't come in and you're going to get any job. Like if the only jobs that are available at this point are the tech level jobs, the people that don't require a whole, as much experience, as much of a skill set. And so, sometimes the amount that you should get kind of impacts the amount of work that you can get or what you can get. So when you're starting out as a field tech, I think sometimes it can be very confusing when you start getting to that middle ground. You're like, wait a minute, I used to, now you're getting more money, but now I'm not getting offered as many jobs. And that's because it's not because they want to pay the bottom level. It's because there's only certain jobs or certain positions in a field effort that require your level of skill. And so we can't just say, okay, well, you know what, let's screw the budget. We'll just hire all 20 of them are field director level. It doesn't work that way. If that's the case, the companies that you work for are not going to be in business anymore, right? Because they're actually going to be paying to work. Mm-hmm. So, that's something that people need to understand is the more money that they're making and the more skill set that they have, they're a little bit more limited in the amount of jobs or the jobs that they can get. Whereas somebody who's right off and, has some experience but doesn't get paid as much is the world's their oyster in comparison. And so I think that, that's one thing that I would like to see people have a better understanding of.
One thing that I would say about this entire conversation is that the process of how you get paid and, the conditions of your employment are a lot more transparent and straightforward with the companies that we're talking about, cultural resources, than they are in academia. I can tell you that right now. A couple of the things that strike me so much different is that, right now I work for a state university. So the pay rate is actually based on some kind of equation that the state of California has decided for me, and that there can be some kind of incremental adjustments of, kind of money on top of the base salary, but it's all based on my, rank and position at the university. So anyone can go in and see how much money I'm paid, what my base salary is. And anyone can see what the incremental bonus that's added, of course, because of where I live. Everyone can totally see, how much I get paid. And that's not the way that it is in a lot of different locations. You don't really get to say anything about how much you're paid. And no matter how well I do, until I make it to the next pay grade, that's all you're going to get. I can be the greatest that anyone's ever seen, and I'll still be, because of my pay grade and my position, I'll still be, at this certain pay rate. But in cultural resources, of course, by moving over to different companies and different locations and everything, you can kind of job hop and increase the amount of money that you're getting paid based on, where you're at and what kind of activities you're being asked to do at the company, right? So, there's definitely that. But the one thing about cultural resources is you can actually show your skills through your the projects you've done and through the people that you're working with and everything. And they'll use that to decide how much money you get paid, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't really do that in academia.
Right.
It doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter, what you do or how much you demonstrate yourself or any of that kind of stuff. Like, you're just stuck at whatever position you're at, right? So
that's a really good point. And I want people to kind of think about that, because this is what I'm hearing on these boards, is where they say, you know what, as soon as you get out with a BA, you should absolutely make this amount, period. No questions. I don't have to prove anything to you. This is what I expect to get paid. And then if I get an MA, then I should make this amount, or within this tight wage range, I should make this amount. And that kind of starts getting you to the point of what you're saying, Bill, is that there's these expected thresholds that don't encourage people to build their skill set. It just encourages you to get to a threshold. It may seem like a good idea right now, but it's not a good idea in the long run, because then you end up with something like Bill's going through, or other people I've seen, have friends in academia that they're working their butt off. And they're such good teachers and communicators, and they put so much into their students, but they will never make this. They'll never, well, I shouldn't say never, eventually, if they stay in for 30 or 20 years, but they're never going to catch up to that guy who's basically teaching one class semester and has some meetings and isn't helping students, doesn't care about students, but he's made that threshold, so he's guaranteed and locked in. And that is something we don't want, because you don't have control with that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there's two different universes in academia. There's a lot of people don't really think about it this way, but essentially all these universities are their own businesses, right? And some of them are, I guess they're just kind of state-owned companies, and they sell degrees, right? And we all need those degrees to qualify to have a chance to get into these, jobs that require the degree, right? So as long as the jobs require the degrees, then you got to go to a place to get them. And fortunately, universities have the lock on what's considered an education, right? So there's two different universes. There's the postdocs and the graduate students and the professors and instructors who are actually delivering the product and creating the ideas and doing the research. And then there's the people who kind of run the entire organization, right? The administration, admin folks, right? So all these different levels of provosts and other coordinators and managers and a whole bunch of other folks, right? Now, some of these jobs are kind of essential, like the people who hire and make sure that we get paid. And so the accountants and all the folks who are making sure that we're in compliance with laws. So all the environmental compliance folks. But then there's a whole bunch of other folks that are kind of like the overseers and administrators of all those different things, right? And those people don't necessarily create anything, and they don't actually, in fact, manage very much. But I can tell you one thing, they make a lot more than the professors. Yes. And so the one way that many professors can get to that higher pay level is to get out of the entire instructor sequence and that ladder and move over to that admin sequence, where it is a lot more like cultural resources, where you job hop and you go from place to place and you network and you make it up to the higher levels of manager and assistant provost or assistant dean. And, if you look at a lot of these folks, we're entering an age where a lot of the people who are running universities actually never taught, or they were only a postdoc for a couple of years, where they learned the entire system of the university and leverage that knowledge and those connections to get themselves a position in admin. And then they're using their PhD to just move higher and higher. But they don't really, since they were graduate students, many of these folks, I wouldn't say many, I would say an increasing number of them, have never actually done research or ever taught, right? And so in that world, you can see where the operation and the way that universities are run, you can definitely see more of a kind of CRM aspect. The biggest difference is that they need customers. The students are the customers, right? And so they don't necessarily need contracts to do work. That's what the professors are trying to get, grants and other things to do the research that they need to keep their jobs. But the folks who are in the admin, they just need to recruit more humans who will pay the tuition. And once again, that's falling down on the professors to recruit the students and to teach the students and to do the research and everything else, while the people behind the scenes are the ones who get paid 2 to 3 times more than professors. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, right? Because I think that the kind of things that a lot of admin folks, and I've thought this about a lot of the principal investigators of CRM companies, I wouldn't want to have that job I mean, I'm not very good at that kind of thing. I wouldn't want to sit in meetings like that. And I definitely don't respond to emails as fast. So I'd be a horrible principal investigator. I'd be a horrible provost and a horrible dean, right? Because I don't think that those kind of things are something that, my skill set's set up for, or that I'm very good at that kind of job. But on the other hand, it's kind of discouraging to see these, folks come in and be making, in California, it's easy to see these folks, assistant chancellors and provosts, making like $270,000 a year.
I know.
I don't make anywhere close to that. So it's crazy to see that the assistant to the backup assistant is making $250,000 a year, and they don't bring a single grant, and they don't actually hire a single person, and they don't even really manage anything. They just write a bunch of edicts and emails and stuff like that, and talk. Zoom meetings.
I would say that, I totally understand the concept, the comparison, but just from my position, my management position, I will tell you that, I'm not just answering emails or going to meetings. I know you're not saying that, but I would say I would make a distinction between in that comparison then is that, we don't get, now, are there people much higher than me that, now are not doing the day in, day out BD, business development, client interaction, actually creating research designs, actually going out into the field and managing crew? I mean, I do everything from, top to bottom. And, there are these people like myself in the middle are working their butt off, and we are in the trenches, I want to make sure that we don't, feed into that concept where the field techs believe that they're the only ones that are doing the real work and they're getting paid a pittance. And it's not true. I mean, I would say if I probably looked at how much I make an hour and then looked at what I make a year and subtracted, or divided, how many hours I actually work, because I'm salary, I'm making probably less than many people in the fields are, just because of the amount of extra work beyond 40 hours that I do. And so, and that's the case. I know I'm not unique in that. So I just think that, again, if people make themselves valuable and they work hard, they have a good attitude and a good work ethic, they will do well in this business. I've seen it. Now, I work in California, which is definitely an easier place to work for CRM. I do think other states are much more difficult, and we're learning that as my company starts growing out to other states. So there are a couple other things I want to touch on before we finish up, and that is, I would like people to understand also that there's a difference in pay between the private sector, these jobs that people are awarded or companies are awarded that are federal jobs, versus the private sector. So you have something called the prevailing wage. And so a lot of time, you have the federal jobs that require that prevailing wage. And so that hits you at a mark that is, that's what you get. I got lucky. My first job in CRM was a prevailing wage job. And so that's what I was paid right off the bat. Like, I didn't have to go with, the lower amounts. And so because that prevailing wage, when somebody bids on a federal project with a prevailing wage, there is no choice in the cost, so that competition is not the same as it is in the private sector. And so the private sector they have to be more, much more strategic with the budgets. And it still means you should be still paying people fair wages, but a prevailing wage is a lot higher than the living wage in all the time. It's higher than the living wage. So, and that's good. I mean, you can get on a federal job with a prevailing wage. That's awesome for you, but it's not the case. So when I see sometimes people are posting on the Facebook sites, and they're posting a minimum or a federal prevailing wage job, and they're all, everybody's like, well, that is what people should get paid. Well, you don't understand. It's a federal job. They don't have a choice. They have to pay that amount. Where with the private sector, it's many times less. And Doug, you have something to say?
Yeah, it was just sort of a general comment. And I apologize if this was touched on. You guys were sort of falling in and out on the audio, so I kind of missed like half of what was said. But it was to somewhat go back to a comment to say that It was actually two comments on things that you said, Heather. One is when you were talking about earlier about, not putting in on your timesheets or, basically doing a lot of training on your own time or work on your own time and whatnot. I would just say for listeners to think about that a little bit more strategically. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, money is an abstraction of time. Money is basically, in most senses, time versus some sort of labor and skill. And so when you are giving up, say work on, you're not taking work, you've done an extra 2 hours at the end of the day and you're not billing that to the company or you're not billing that to, whoever your employer is, whatever. That is essentially you as an individual taking on a business risk because you are basically hoping that this is an investment that will pay off. Mm-hmm. And it's just to say to people, think about it that way and realize that it's not always going to pay off. So, in any sort of business, you do a bunch of initiatives, you put in a lot of bids on contracts and you don't get them. Or, stuff goes sideways. And that's the same thing to think about when you're putting in for training and stuff like that. You may, say, not put in, 80 hours, 180 hours over a year at a company. And then you may get nothing out of that. And that can be quite discouraging and can make people quite bitter. But, sometimes I basically have to say it's putting you the risk. And it's a bit back to what you were saying, Heather, on some of the stuff, of working hard. I think there is also an element of luck that goes mm-hmm. into that as well. So if for the listeners, it's to think about is yes, hard work will work, but sometimes it's actually just luck. Mm-hmm. Some people, connections. Some people do just fine not putting in a lot of hard work, and some people put in an incredible amount of hard work and get nowhere. So it's just to say that I think part of it is to look at when, if you're look at it as an investment. So when you're not taking time or when you're volunteering for stuff, and this is going beyond just work. This is like when you volunteer to help run a conference or, you volunteer at a conference or you volunteer at a little community dig, on your weekends off or something like that to help out someone, or your friend at a university asks you to review a paper for them before they send it off for peer review, stuff like that. That's all sort of, think about it as an investment in mm-hmm. yourself. And that's how I think is a good way to, if people are taking away stuff from that is, you're investing and not all of your investments are going to come through. I think it was Bill, I think you told me that you followed something where you basically invested in 10 stocks each year mm-hmm. and a lot of them completely failed, but the ones that paid off for the rest of them. Is that you were telling me that, right, Bill? Yeah.
And that absolutely helped me get that down payment on a house, the money that I got from that. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And so it's thinking about that when you're taking these, not putting extra time on your timesheet, volunteering places is not all of them are going to pay off, but hopefully enough of them will pay off that it's worth it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think to wrap this all up, we started off the episode by talking about making sure that you're educating yourself to the point where, you're setting yourself up for success. And so the same thing is, yes, absolutely, Doug, you're right. There is a lot of luck involved, but you can also set yourself up to be ready for when that fortunate, lucky circumstance happens. But if you aren't ready when luck knocks on your door and you haven't prepared yourself, you've lost that opportunity. So I think that's probably the moral of the story here is just have an open mind and try to educate yourself and constantly improve yourself. And you're going to be a lot happier if you try to look at it from the other perspective, and you'll start learning how to strategize how you can make yourself even more valuable and you can start making more money.
That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRMArchPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at archpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about.
Thanks, everyone, for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Oh, the countdown. The question is, will he do it before?
Goodbye.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.